Cultural Flashpoints Vidcast. My name is Dawn Solowey, and I am a labor and employment partner and litigator and counselor in Seyfarth Shaw's Boston office. And one of my areas of expertise is religious discrimination and accommodation. And I am so happy to be talking to my colleague and friend, Annette Tyman, today, who is, I'll let her introduce herself, but she is the chair of our People Analytics group, among many other things. So Annette, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me to have this chat. I head up our People Analytics practice group that includes a variety of subject matters, including artificial intelligence, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all the changes that have taken place over the last year and beyond that, pay analyses and looking at employer practices. So a lot of data-driven work, but also just helping employers deal with various workplace issues around pay, AI, DEI, and federal contracting and state contracting issues primarily.
And so, Annette, I know you and I have collaborated quite a bit on the topic of faith-based employee resource groups, or sometimes called employee affinity groups. And so we're excited to bring that conversation to the listeners of this podcast today. And so I thought first it would make sense to kind of just set the table. So employee resource groups or employee affinity groups, we'll call them ERGs for today's purposes, well, maybe Annette, you can sort of set the table as to how do you define what is an employee resource group?
Sure. So, at a high level, employee resource groups are typically, they're employer sponsored or employer supported groups. They're typically employee led. They're designed to create some sort of connection, community, belonging in the workplace. They've been around for quite a long time. They started really out of an effort to address exclusion in the workplace. And I think over time, employers have realized that these groups can really serve a lot of important business purposes. So things like employee engagement, retention, in some instances, development for leaders, and just even providing insight into how a company can connect with customers or communities. There's lots of groups that have formed. There's also sometimes, groups that have formed around special interests. It could be, the tennis club, right? So all of that relates to bringing the sense of belonging and connection in the workplace. Well, what I think we're going to focus a little bit more here is on the, traditional employer-sponsored employee resource groups that have typically focused on certain groups, women, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ employees, not always limited to those groups. And certainly we've seen a lot of shifts more recently, but that's primarily the group that we're at least going to be talking about today.
Yeah, that's a great overview. And I think in today's conversation, we're going to be talking in a little more depth about faith-based employee resource groups, because I know Annette and I and our colleagues at Seyfarth have been seeing a trend toward more employee requests for faith-based ERGs. So Annette, can you say a little bit more about what we've been seeing with regard to that trend?
Absolutely. So we've definitely seen a noticeable uptick. From at least my practice area, it's been the last few years that I started seeing those changes, that shift. A lot of it, I think, was tied to this broader shift towards bringing your whole self to work. And some employees, right, have become more comfortable talking about identity and purpose and meaning. And for many people, faith is a core part of that. And certainly the more recent Hamas and Israel conflict that's really, kind of kicked off in 2023 or, enhanced in 2023 also contributed to those requests. And so, this desire for community, mutual support, understanding, things like that, questions around holidays and fasting, all of those kinds of questions have started to percolate in a more direct way, such that employees were more willing to bring those requests forward.
Yeah, and I know that there was a time where many employers had a bright line rule around ERGs, like no politics, no religion. And one of the things that Annette and I have been talking about a lot and kind of working together on is, to what extent is that still, a best practice? So Annette, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about kind of what the legal basis was for that rule of no politics and no religions and religion and ERGs?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because that there was a time when it really was a no politics, no religion rules, even pretty explicitly, even in a ERG policy document or framework. From a legal perspective, politics isn't a protected characteristic under federal law, so employers had a lot more flexibility there. Certainly, religion is protected, but courts have historically allowed employers to limit religious expression if they do so in a neutral and even-handed way. So there was a case that came out in the mid 2000s out of the Seventh Circuit that suggested that an employer could restrict religious expression as long as it excluded all equally, right? So, and here I'm not talking about all religious expression in a broad sense. I'm talking very specifically about an employee resource group, right? So the fact that an employer resource group was excluded, that really was the issue that the court in the Seventh Circuit explicitly weighed in on. And so it made it easier for many employers to adopt that framework. And it shaped a lot of the employer policies that were in place over the years.
Yeah, and we've seen that case appears to still be good law. And at the same time, we have seen just kind of out in the market that many employers' position has evolved as to religious-based ERGs. Not all, certainly some employers still have a no politics, no religion rule, but we have seen an evolution as allowing more faith-based groups. So can you talk, Annette, a little bit more about, kind of what we've been seeing in terms of that evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, not uniform agreement as what you shared, but certainly a lot more openness and not a immediate rush to either approve or deny faith-based employee resource groups. So a lot more questions, a lot more willingness to pause and evaluate. Should we move forward? What does that look like? Part of that is employee driven, as I mentioned. There's just we're seeing a lot more requests that are coming up, and part of that just reflects also, I think, a broader shift in the legal and cultural landscape. The environment this year in particular looks very different from what it did a decade ago or even 5 years ago. Employers lived through all the religious-based vaccine litigation, which you are so deeply involved with, starting in 2021. And that certainly heightened a lot of awareness around religious accommodation and discrimination issues. And so a recurring theme in those cases was the argument that medical or disability exemptions were somehow treated more favorably than religious requests, and that religion was being viewed as sort of a lesser protected category. And so, along with that, the developments such as the Supreme Court's Groff decision in 2023, there's certainly been a lot more increased attention to religious discrimination issues generally. We've heard the EOC talking a lot about religious discrimination issues and just, signaling just greater attention on the issue of religious accommodation and discrimination issues. And so that has caused employers to assess those requests in perhaps a different way. And it's also prompted a lot of our discussion and dialogue around how those the reasoning in those cases might be applicable if a certain case came up, similar to the Seventh Circuit case that I talked about. At the same time, we have seen many large employers implement faith-based or interfaith-based employee resource groups, and they've been able to operate them successfully with the right structure and the right guardrails in place. So through that lens, I don't think there's a single answer that necessarily applies to all employers, but reasonable employers can land in different places based on their own employee base. But I think it does help explain why many organizations are just more open to considering faith-based ERG requests rather than relying on blanket rules across the board.
Yeah, and I know it's really interesting to see how companies have gone about faith-based ERGs because there's kind of one model where individual religions have ERGs. So you might have, a Christian ERG, a Muslim, a Jewish ERG. And other companies that have moved more toward an interfaith, like one interfaith group. Can you talk a little bit about what those options look like and how that plays out in the market?
Sure. And I think I would add a third. So I would say, certainly the faith-based specific ERG, it's, a specific group. It's a Christian group or a Jewish group or the Muslim group, whatever group comes forward and says, I want an ERG, right? I've also seen an approach on interfaith ERG. So similar to the interfaith network that you're talking about, but I'll get to that in a minute. But interfaith meaning it's not about any particular religion or combinations. It's just faith. It's a
Hmm.
high level kind of just faith, approach, not tied to any single religion, designed to recognize and support a wide range of beliefs. So we're not talking about Christian or Jewish beliefs or anything else. And then the third model, I think that's probably what you were referencing, is this interfaith network. So there's like a structure where there's a broader interfaith umbrella. And then within that, various faith specific ERGs can operate. So it kind of it allows companies to provide that consistency across the network level, but then it also allows for more, tradition specific groups where there's interest to have perhaps their own a smaller event, for example. So the interfaith network supports that. They often work together. So it acknowledges this, network and individual groups within that. So just adding that third nuance in there is that interfaith ERG as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's perfect. And I mean, I think it's so interesting the way that, different approaches work differently for, work better or worse for different companies. And I think we've seen that a lot that, the answer for one company may not be the right answer for another company. Is it true in your experience that if an employer allows one religion to have an ERG, it has to allow all religions to have an ERG? Because I think that's a common question that clients wonder about.
Yeah, I think if it is, I mean, I think consistency is critical. And certainly if we're looking at the Seventh Circuit case that I mentioned, if you are allowing a religion, so we're going to acknowledge it as a religious ERG, then generally you have to be prepared to allow for other religions as well. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of treating one religion less favorably than another. That can, raise discrimination concerns. That doesn't mean you have to approve every request automatically. All of the employee resource groups or requests for them, religious or otherwise, really should be subject to the same neutral criteria. So you're looking at everything under the policy framework that you have in place. But I would say, generally speaking, that if you open the door to a religion, a specific religion, then at least you need to be prepared to allow for other religious groups to form as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned, the criteria, and I think earlier you used the word guardrails, and that is, of course, really important when it comes to an ERG framework, right? Is what are the criteria and guardrails around the system, which is true generally, but it's especially true when you're talking about faith-based ERGs. So, can you talk a little bit about how you help clients develop that kind of framework?
Sure. So we strongly encourage employers to have a written framework or a charter, depending on the term that the employer wants to use, that applies across the board to all employee resource groups. And typically, there's going to be some sort of clear mission that aligns with the company values for each employee resource group. Why are you allowing the resource group to form, right? It's tied to belonging aspects or engagement aspects or whatever, mission of that particular organization that aligns with the overall employer's perspective. You're confirming that all groups, require open membership. You might decide to, require an executive sponsor. That might be an issue that you do. You would have clear rules around respectful conduct for all employee resource groups, regardless of a particular group that asks, that might be propping forward or coming forward. How do you handle events? How do you handle budgets? Are there approvals needed for certain types of events? Can you invite speakers without approval? How is compensable time going to work? And so if you have an overall framework that applies, then regardless of the group that comes forward, there should also be rules around, the formation. What do you need to come forward with a particular employee resource group, including a faith-based group? So when it comes to faith-based groups in particular, it's really important to address certain boundaries. So you might have things like no coercion, no disruption in the workplace, no proselytizing about a religion in the workplace. So those might be a couple of areas that you need to bolster. But by and large, when you look at a really good policy, they're all going to require respect in the workplace for all other groups, right? So you shouldn't have to do too much more, although there might be a couple of additional nuances. But when you have that framework in place, it really helps you make decisions about every request that comes through. It shifts the focus away from the identity that's coming forward, the specific group, the specific request, and then you're focusing more on about how the group is going to function. So if you had a minimum group size to have formation, or an employer sponsor, management sponsor, before you allow formation, that helps you navigate the nuances and the questions that oftentimes come up.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I think, the executive sponsor requirement can be really valuable for making sure that it's, a group that's going to have some sort of breadth of support. And also, of course, that ERGs have to be open to everyone. And so that's something that the charter can emphasize. And, like you said, the fact that, the normal company policies still apply. For example, the non-discrimination, non-harassment policy, of course. And so, you and I have talked a lot about whether there's a change in the risk environment around a blanket denial of faith-based ERGs. And you alluded to a couple of these factors, the increase in religious accommodation and discrimination claims, some changes in the law from the Supreme Court, and an increased focus by the current administration on religious rights. And so, I know one of the things we've talked about is there perhaps some increased risk that an employee might say, why does my employer have a women's ERG, race-based ERGs, an LGBTQ group, but not religious groups? So can you kind of explain to our listeners what your current thinking is on that issue?
Yeah, that's, I think, where things get really interesting. And, you and I have talked about this quite a bit. I think if you, got together with some other practitioners, they might have a different view. We're certainly hearing a lot from the EEOC. You've seen a lot in the vaccine cases specifically, where courts are weighing in very specifically regarding religious, discrimination. Certainly the Supreme Court has weighed in very clearly in recent years. And so as we think about it, I think there is probably a greater likelihood that if there was a blanket no on religious, or faith-based ERGs, that might get some pushback in this environment. So that, at least allows us to have the conversation with employers. That doesn't mean I have a specific case that says, this is what the outcome would look like. But it is an interesting question and lots of evolution there. I think having a blanket refusal is probably higher risk. I think you can still say no after a review of what the specific request is or how the request gets positioned, but it should be fact specific. I would say is probably where I'm leaning, as opposed to having a policy document that just across the board gives a blanket refusal. But I think, we still have the only case that's out there that definitively speaks to the issue is the Seventh Circuit case that says you don't have to have, something out as long as you exclude all faith-based employee resource groups. You don't have to allow any of them to exist, or a particular one to exist. So no definitive answer, but certainly something that we've been grappling with, thinking about evolving on as well.
Another topic that we've talked about is that for certain religions, there may be some overlap between religious identity and cultural identity, or even national origin identity or race. For example, a Jewish group or a Muslim group of employees may be seeking to explore both religious identity in an ERG, but also, cultural or national origin identities. So how do you think about that overlap when you're helping clients to, formulate these kinds of criteria and guidelines around ERGs?
Yeah, it's really important to, I think listen, to review, right? Because you're right that this isn't some of the requests. Religious identity is not sort of neatly separated from, you know, national origin identity or cultural or ethnic identity. So taking a close look at what the specific request is I think really, really important. So looking at what the request is, evaluating the group that's seeking to form through the same ERG charter and policy framework, and then applying those standards consistently, I think is important. I don't think you have to resolve every distinction that there might be, saying this is specific cultural, this is a cultural issue, or this is a religious issue. But and frankly, I think if you're drawing hard lines, I think that's where you're going to get into more trouble, or potentially more trouble. But so what I think about is focusing less on what label applies and look instead to how the group is asking to operate. So what does their submission look like? What are they seeking to do? And then use your overall framework that you've developed in consultation with legal counsel to see what the shifts have been, and have the conversation about how they propose to operate. I think is really, really key. How do they plan to engage other employees? How do the activities align with the company's existing framework? Are all critical questions to ask, because in this space, there is no like one size fits all across the board.
Yeah, it seems like active listening to the client is a key theme
Absolutely.
here.
Absolutely.
Any final words of wisdom for employers who are navigating this very much evolving space?
Yeah, I think there's just been a lot more change. And I would say that my biggest takeaway is that faith-based, ERGs, they're not inherently problematic. I think ignoring the issue or taking an inflexible approach really can create some challenges. I don't think you have to endorse any particular system or belief, but be consistent and respectful and thoughtful when you're going through the process, having clear policies and having an open dialogue, asking lots of questions about the group and the formation is really important. Some employers have really navigated faith-based ERGs in a really positive and helpful way, that employees really feel a sense that they can bring their whole selves to work. Others have gotten tripped up. So I see both sides. And so I think the approach here is to ensure that you're having a really thoughtful conversation and considerations, because, where we're at right now is certainly living in a different place than we were certainly 5 years ago.
Thank you so much, Annette. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom here today. I know you and I will definitely continue this conversation, but I'm glad we were able to share it with our Flashpoints Vidcast listeners. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.